I went totally in the box about 2003, and it was one of the best changes I ever made for both speed and workflow. But as good as that change was, it cost me something: my console. And at first I didn't miss having it, but over time I began to hear sonic differences. Because after recording and mixing on a desk for so long, I have learned how to hear instruments in their natural state, so that's what I'm always listening for. Now, I'm not here to debate whether mixing in the box is better than mixing on a console. There are plenty of videos out there for you to watch on that topic. But after 40 plus years in this business, with 25 of those years behind real desks, there are specific things a console trains your ears to hear that working totally in the box never will. And it's not because an in-the-box workflow is inferior. It's just that the experience between the two is very different. And that difference shapes how you hear. So today, you'll learn 3 console disciplines. And by the end of this video, you'll know how to apply those disciplines while working totally in the box. So let's go. Let's start with gain staging. On a console, you know immediately when you get the gain staging wrong. The noise floor becomes apparent, and the opposite is true when you go over the operating level. You get distortion. The first issue is a consequence of not having enough level during tracking, and the other is a hot signal overloading the operating level of the stereo mix bus. If you were recording the tape, both scenarios are unacceptable. Now, in a DAW, you can ignore gain staging for the most part because you have a wider dynamic range. The meters look fine and everything sounds okay until you're deep into a multi-track mix and wondering why the low end is muddy, why the top end is dull, and why the plugins aren't responding the way you think they should. Now, most of the time, those problems are computational. Signals going through every plugin, aux channel, and the mix bus has a potential for mathematical error. Now, if those errors existed during tracking, then the problem might compound on its way out of the mix bus. Now, a console doesn't let you get away with that, and here's what I mean. On a console, each channel has a fixed gain structure that feeds the stereo mix output, which has its own gain structure. Now, on some consoles, you're not afforded the sonic luxury of a wide dynamic range. So you're now forced to carefully manage the gain relationship between the individual channels and the stereo mix output. Now, keep in mind, an analog console deals with voltages, so every fader move that you make tells you something in real time, and it's not subtle. In a DAW, that relationship exists, but due to the wider dynamic range of the digital workflow, problems can and oftentimes will be missed. So here's what you can do. First, use the calibration plugin to set your 0 dB reference level to -18 dBFS prior to recording anything. Second, pay attention to how the signal to be recorded sounds in its natural state before it goes in the box. Now, ideally, you want to hear that same character on the mix bus. Now, once that's done, aim to have each recorded signal hit your mix bus at -18. You will have some wiggle room, and you're only limited by the dynamic range of your hardware. Now, approaching your gain staging like this treats the DAW like an analog console. Of course, you're still at the mercy of computational error, but at least you know what your margins are. If you're finding this content useful, please do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing so this information could get out to more people. Back to the program. Now, the second thing. When I first started working seriously in the box, I thought the undo button was a gift. I mean, after 30 years of committing decisions to tape and suddenly a button click could take any of that back, that felt like freedom. But everything has a cost. And what I didn't see was how lazy I was becoming. And here's why that matters. On a console, when you reach for the EQ, you're not auditioning options. You're making a decision. And because you're making that decision in real time, you listen differently before you touch anything. Your approach to audio problems is now more calculated, and once problems are solved, you commit the mix to tape. In the box mixing, inverts that. Now, you're not deciding. You are exploring. And exploring costs you something. Time. You stop trusting what you hear and you start fumbling with the next plugin. And that is a total waste of time. Because an infinite palette of plugin options is slowly teaching you one thing: to distrust your own ears. I mean, I've watched people waste 45 minutes tweaking the EQ on a snare, and it's not because the snare needed a lot of work. It was simply because they're plugin junkies. Now, the console would have limited them to a few options. So let me expand on that for a minute. Fewer options place you under commitment and constraint. The constraint of the console channel EQ, or maybe you have an outboard one. And constraints build and sharpen your listening skills. Remove the constraint entirely and suddenly those skills fade away bit by bit. So here's what you can do. Print and commit. Once you've dialed in your EQ setting, bounce it to a new file and remove the plugin altogether. You now just given yourself the constraint the console was providing. And that's not a workaround. That is strictly a discipline. And having that discipline builds your skill set. Now, the third thing. And this is one most in-the-box mixers have never been told. Ditch the solo switch. And here's why. On a console, the channel signal is always moving through the mix output. And from the moment you bring up the faders, you're hearing the instruments in context with everything that's happening within the mix and not in isolation. So while you're adjusting faders, you're developing an awareness of how instruments relate to one another. For instance, when you raise the kick channel, you have to listen for any low-end fighting that might be taking place, because the bottom end is where most problems occur. Now you're checking to hear how the kick drum relates to the bass guitar track and any other lower mid instruments feeding the 2-track mix. Now, the relationship between these tracks shapes your EQ decisions and any level changes you might make. What you will realize more often than not is that you don't need to be as heavy-handed in the changes you're going to make, which in turn is a clear indication that everything was well recorded during tracking. Now contrast that with the solo button and the mantra of "we'll fix it in the mix," which is one of the most dangerous habits in modern mixing. Here's what I mean. In the box mixers, solo a track, identify a problem, fix said problem, unsolo the track, and then move on. And that process feels productive, and it is, if you're dealing with a single instrument recorded. Because a track that sounds okay solo can sound wrong in the context of the entire multi-track mix. So here's what you can do for every mix session. Ban the solo button for the first couple of playbacks. Bring up a static mix, work in context of the entire mix, and listen for problems like fighting in the bottom end between bass and drums, or a mid-range heavy keyboard that's stepping on the vocal track. Critical listening is what's necessary to identify which instruments need to be raised, lowered, or totally omitted. And this is a console discipline that you could apply to your next session. 3 disciplines: gain staging, committing, and hearing the mix in context. None of those require a console, but all 3 are applicable disciplines that change the way you listen. And critical listening is a skill set that follows you your entire career. Now I want to hear from you. Have you noticed any of these habits in your own workflow? The solo button especially? Let me know in the comments. I'm Warren Henry, and until the next one, peace.